Diving Deeper Discussions. I'm Randy Isaac, your host, on behalf of the American Scientific Affiliation, and we're here to discuss the publications in the current issue of our journal, Perspectives on Science and Christian Faith. And today we begin our discussion of the latest issue, the December 2022 issue of the journal. And we're very pleased to focus on the lead article here. It is entitled, An Attempt to Understand the Biology of Gender and Gender Dysphoria, a Christian Approach. And we're very pleased to welcome the author, Tony Jelsma. Tony, welcome.
Thank you.
All right. It's great to have you here. I know you've been an ASA member for more than 20 years and a fellow, I think, for a couple of years. Yeah. So it's a pleasure to have you here. But I think many of our audience may not know you very well, and the rest of us would like to know you a little bit better. So let's dig into your background a little bit. Where were you born and raised?
Okay, I was born and raised in Burlington, Ontario, Southern Ontario.
Another Canadian. Uh-oh.
Yes. Well, actually, on Tuesday, I will, Lord willing, no longer be a Canadian because I got my citizenship appointment Tuesday morning. So after 22, 23 years, I finally, so I'm finally taking the plunge.
Okay.
But anyway, so yes, I'm from Ontario. My undergrad and grad degrees are from McMaster University in biochemistry. I've always been interested in really molecular biology and understanding how things work, at the biological level. And after my PhD, I spent 3 years in England from 88 to 91 doing cancer research as a postdoc. And then after that, I spent 5 years in Montreal, and this was switching to neuroscience research from 91 to 96. These are pretty important years, and both in England, 88 to 91 with the Gulf War and all that, and then in Quebec with the referendum and all that sort of stuff. But then after a while, I realized, well, maybe my calling is not to be, a full-time lab researcher or anything like that. I was more interested in how my faith interacts with what I'm doing in the scientific level. So I started thinking.
So speaking of faith, let's go back to your origins. Yeah. Were you born into a family of faith?
I was born into the Reformed faith, and I still hold that faith. I've been a member of many different Reformed and Presbyterian churches, depending on where I've lived, and now I'm a member of the PCA, the Presbyterian Church in America. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, you did a rapid fire sequence of where you were. So I didn't want to interrupt that too much, but where did we leave you off here? You started talking about integrating your faith and your science.
Right. So then I started thinking about teaching at a Christian a Christian institution like a college or university or so. And I taught for 4 years in Moncton, New Brunswick. It was called Atlantic Baptist University at the time. Now it's called Crandall University, where I was the first professor in a new biology department. That was kind of rough. But I was there for 4 years. And then Arnold Sycamore sent me an email saying, he was at Dort at the time, and saying, well, one of our biology professors is retiring. He teaches in the human biology area. Would you know anyone who's interested? And I said, yeah, me. So one thing led to another, and ended up here in 2000, and I've been here ever since, and I plan to stay here until I retire.
All right. Wait, what year did you get to Dort?
2000.
2000. Okay, so you've been there for a little bit. That's great. A real Iowan in here. So, okay. So back to your integrating faith and your science. Where did that really arise, and how did you really pursue that angle?
Well, initially it was Jitse van der Meer. He organized this conference at Redeemer, and I forget when that was. It was probably in the late 90s. And he and I, because he and I grew up in the same denomination, and so we had communicated a fair bit. And he's been a great help for me in that regard.
And he just joined right before you said that. So it's good.
Hi Jitse, wherever you are, I can't see you, but anyway. So he was really instrumental in helping me see that my faith is important, and and not, I mean, in terms of my science and how I think of it. And science may not be as objective as we might like to think it is. And and then just one thing led to another. I joined the ASA, started going to some of the meetings.
Tell me more about that. How did you hear about was it Jitsi who connected you, or how did you hear about the ASA? And
that was a long time ago. That was a long time ago. I don't remember.
It's only 20 years.
Well, I think I was a member before and let my membership lapse and then joined again.
Okay. So, all right. We'll have to dig into that a little bit. Yeah. Okay. So, all right. So you've been here at Dort for a couple of decades now, and you're pretty well settled. Seem to be happy with it. But how did you get into today's topic? That doesn't sound like it's been a long-term topic of yours, but what led you to pursue this angle?
Yeah, it's been a few years now, and it really wasn't something that I had intended to go into, but I was going through a divorce about 12 years ago or so, and then after that, my youngest child came out as trans, and I didn't know what was going on. I didn't understand it. I didn't react well to it either. In fact, they didn't want to tell me, kind of kept it under wraps. But when it became clear that was the situation, and I think the whole family instability stuff may contribute to that somewhat. But then I just thought, well, first of all, I'm a biologist, and let me look at the biology. That's the way questions. That's the way I deal with questions. I just start researching and looking into it. The other thing is I had a conversation with my child's counselor at the time, and she says, well, you're a Christian, so what do you have against someone being transgender? And I could not articulate a clear answer. I just said, well, the Bible says it's wrong. Well, the Bible doesn't talk about gender. And so I realized I need to do a lot more hunting or digging and researching and to be able to clarify my position in that regard as well. And in the article, I talk about various approaches that Christians have to the whole question. But we do need to think about, if we're going to justify from a theological position and not just use the clobber text, from Genesis 1, we need to have a more articulate response to those sorts of questions.
So this was a very personal journey for you.
Yeah, exactly. So then as I started researching into it, I thought, well, this is something that maybe the ASA wants to hear. And so it was 2021, we had the virtual ASA annual meeting, and I gave a talk there. And it wasn't long after that Jim Peterson emailed me and said, well, we were thinking we might want to have a theme issue in perspectives on this topic. Would you be willing to be a co-editor? I gulped. I had to think about it for a little bit. And so I said, okay. And then, so I started writing an invitational essay and actually presented kind of for the Canadian Science Christian, whatever, it's the SCA. That was in November 21. Some of you may have seen that as well. But I was asking other people saying, are you willing to contribute to this article, to this issue? And nobody wanted to. Either they didn't have time or didn't feel they could do justice to it or whatever. So it ended up being me and just me. And I remember the conversations I had with Jim. I said, Jim, this article is getting longer and longer. What about this 8,000 word limit? And he said, don't worry about it. Just write what you need to write. And so I apologize for the length of the article, but I could have gone on considerably further as well.
Wow. Yeah. So then you gave another talk in this past winter as well. So you've built up a little portfolio here, which is very helpful.
Because Jim wanted that article, I forget, it was in May. Yeah. So when I submitted it, and then in the summer, I keep on reading on this stuff. And then I realized that the whole aspect of perception and how we perceive things, how we perceive ourselves and whatever, I didn't really do justice to it into the article. And so I read a little bit further, and that's really what I presented on this summer at the ASA meeting. Right. And I also gave a talk that in my response to the letter to the editor, I also gave a link to that as well. So I'm still progressing.
Yeah, we keep learning all that. So I think since we sent out a link, I think most of our attendees here may have read your article, but it was, as you pointed out, it's fairly lengthy and quite detailed. And since some attendees here may not have read it, could you kind of highlight what are the main points very briefly? Just what are the main points and go over that before we open it up for discussion?
Sure. The As I was reading it, I was looking for what might be a biological cause for an incongruence between someone's gender, their perceived gender, and their biological sex. And so for most of us, we don't even think about our gender. It's just, we look down in the shower and we know what sex we are, and we just act accordingly. But then I was reading, it was Mark Yarhouse wrote a book a few years ago on gender dysphoria. And then just reading that made me realize this is real. It's real for some people. They don't want it. It happens to them. And so I said, there must be some kind of biological basis for that. So that's really what I was looking at. And so what sort of biological causes? Could there be something genetic? And there are some genes that are correlated with a higher incidence of gender dysphoria, or some gene variants, but not a whole lot. And what I came down to is I'm thinking it's a hormonal imbalance before birth. And so sex development or genital development happens earlier on in pregnancy. The brain's masculinization or feminization happens later on in pregnancy or in gestation. And I'm thinking maybe it's an imbalance there, either exposure to environmental estrogens or maybe some genetic thing that causes it. And then these people, their brains and their bodies are the opposite sex. And so that's what I see as the early onset gender dysphoria. These are the kids who say, have always said, I am not a boy or I am not a girl and whatever. And we go on from that. The other condition is the late onset gender dysphoria, where people have no inkling that these people have gender dysphoria as a child. And once they reach puberty and adolescence, then all of a sudden they come out and say, I'm trans. And I'm trying to think of what's going on in there. Now, it is possible that some kind of programming before birth doesn't get revealed until adolescence or puberty. But I think there's a lot more to it than that. And that's where I was looking into the whole idea of perception and the development of the mind-body connection. And that develops profoundly during adolescence. And I think if there's instability going on at that time, and maybe nudging people in one direction or another, or people are socially isolated or whatever, those sort of connections don't develop as they should. And again, this is nothing I can prove, but I've given a lot of circumstantial evidence in that way to think that's what's going on in that case. The other thing that I need to point out is, again, those studies, there's a few studies that say a large proportion of the people with early onset gender dysphoria that desists once they reach puberty. And I suspect it's once the sex hormones, increase it to higher levels, it just swamps out anything else. But then some of them persist. But the challenge is, how do we know which will desist and which will persist? And so the argument has been, well, if they got childhood gender dysphoria, let's let them transition before they reach puberty so they don't develop the secondary sexual characteristics, and the transition is going to be a whole lot easier. But what if these are people who are going to desist in the first place? Now, right. For those people who persist, if you say, well, let's just wait and see how it goes, well, then the dysphoria intensifies in puberty. Right. And that's so tough. Are we going to allow them to go through that as well? So sorry, I'm talking longer, but that's
that's great. Yeah, that provides us with a wealth of things to get into. So at this point, let's open it up for discussion, and I'll ask Vicki to open up the microphones. And as usual, our rules are we're going to start with those who sent questions in advance, and I will call on you in order in which you sent it in. And I'd ask everyone else to keep your microphone muted so we don't get background effects here. And afterwards, I would, after we have the question submitted in advance, I would ask you if you want to say something, go to your reactions icon at the bottom. Click on that, and then click on the raise hand option, and then I will call on you in the order in which you raise your hand. We'll have our discussion. So we have 3 questions that were submitted in advance, and the first came from Ken Turian. I see you there, Ken. How about unmuting yourself and taking your mute off and asking him your question? Ken, you're going to have to take yourself off of mute. Yeah, you got to unmute button. There you go. Go ahead.
I'm ready.
All right. Yeah.
Well, I was a little harsh in my first question, but now that I realize there's a personal issue here, this is how I started, and let me ask the question. The sudden plague of what I call unnecessary gender changes bothered me, especially with high school kids as they go through puberty. But the key question becomes, how do we deal with the ideologically driven people who are using this natural anomaly to promote a worldview that seeks to undermine the Judeo-Christian worldview? This is my key question. Is that clear?
Yeah.
Yeah, it is.
I got a copy. I got a copy of the question already, so I've seen it before. I guess when I look at this question, I wonder if we've got things in the right order. First of all, people are doing all kinds of things to undermine a Judeo-Christian worldview. And I think if we should be starting with the worldview and seeing what comes out from that. So how do we deal with that? Well, the same way we deal with people who want to undermine a Christian worldview in any other context. And I think that is love them, reach out to them with the gospel and help them know that the gospel is most important. And let's start from there and let things follow. So this is just one example, but it happens everywhere, and we get attacked by all kinds of things. But that is also assuming, so that's ideologically driven people who are trying to undermine them. But there are a lot of people who have a Christian worldview and still have this gender dysphoria that they need to deal with. And I want to be careful that we're not lumping everyone together. I have a friend who I mentioned in the article, Greg Eilers, and he was the one who had lifelong gender dysphoria. He transitioned to a woman, and then upon taking estrogen, the dysphoria resolved, and he would transition back to a man as long as he stays on estrogen. And I invited him to this discussion this afternoon, and he says, "I'm not sure I have the heart to do it," because he's been for so long trying to convince people that there are Christians who have a solidly Christian worldview, and he keeps on getting attacked and misunderstood and misrepresented. And I think we have to be really careful when we're doing these things, talking about it, to reach out with love to people. And even if we disagree with their position, that's one thing, but we still need to communicate and reach out to them.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Tony. I have a case that bothers me intensely, just very shortly. This guy is an ASA member, Christian, whose son got his PhD degree. At age 28 or 29, he was hired by a government laboratory, was doing just fine, a person. And then all of a sudden he realizes he's a woman. He's 29 years old, goes through the whole process, becomes a woman, changes his name. The laboratory fires him because it's a serious matter to be with a classified laboratory and change gender. And there he is. I am there just looking. I can't even make sense of it myself. I don't want to give names because he's known. At least his father is known as an ASA member. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can't speak to a particular situation. Everyone's situation is different, and we need to look at it and see what's going on there. And even then, we just may not understand what's behind it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you.
Clearly, cases that are difficult to deal with. Yeah. Okay, thank you, Ken. And the second question came from Del Kuhn. Del, you're usually here somewhere. Are you here? I don't see you. Let's see, Del, are you there? Yeah, you're here. Del, can you unmute yourself? Ask your question. Did you fall asleep on us? Okay. Andy. All right. Let's go. Okay. Where are you? There you are. Okay, go ahead. You got it. Oh, you're going back and forth. Yeah, no, try again. You went back to mute. Try again. Del, get your mute off. Get your microphone on. You've done this before. No, you're still not getting it.
Randy, move on and come back to him.
Yeah, okay. You can figure out your mute button. Let's go on to question number 3. We'll come back to you, Del. David Yee had a question. I see you over here, David. Why don't you go ahead and ask your question? Vicky,
I see David, but he's still muted.
David, Vicky, did we unintentionally get the microphones locked again?
No, it looks like everybody has the ability to unmute themselves.
Something's gone haywire here. I don't think we've had that before. David, there you go. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I wasn't able to unmute for a while. Okay. Before I ask my question, I just want to kind of ask a clarificatory question, and that is, from what you state, am I correct in thinking that early onset cases happen before puberty and late onset instances happen after puberty? Is that the dividing line between early onset and late onset?
Yes.
Okay, fine. My question is, with your own chemistry background, and you mentioned it in your introduction, there are compounds with estrogen activating properties that we're getting into the environment. And I was wondering about the effect of these estrogenic compounds in the environment on increasing the instances of gender dysphoria, and whether it may affect more early onset cases or late onset cases, or both, or we don't know.
Very good question, and I'm glad you asked, because it reminded me of, I'm trying to remember. Yes, I saw your question earlier. I was looking into the estrogens, environmental estrogens. One of the things I didn't mention is the early onset cases. They've been around for a long time. I don't know if anyone remembers Walter Carlos was a musician and transitioned to Wendy Carlos. And I was a kid, I think, at the time. And so the early onset has been around for forever. More recently, there's been a dramatic increase in the late onset, and particularly from female to male. And I discussed that at the annual meeting as well. And it's like, why is it increasing so dramatically? And why is it preferentially females going to males? So I was thinking about that. And if most of these environmental hormones are actually estrogenic, that would not be a cause for the increase in more girls transitioning to boys, but it might be more the other way around. However, we don't really understand how gender develops anyway in the brain. It's really kind of a holistic process. And so all I can say is maybe, but if we really don't know the neural basis for something like gender, then we don't know how it could change. We certainly know that there are plenty of genes in the brain whose expression levels are regulated by estrogen, and so that could have an effect. The other thing I want to point out is there was one figure that I put in the paper in terms of developmental biology. Developmental biology is not absolutely programmed, but I had this, what's called the Waddington's landscape. It's sort of like a ball running down the hill. And depending on the topology and how the ball bounces, it'll go one direction or another. If you do many of those, you get a pattern, a regular repeating pattern, but it doesn't mean that things can't change. So maybe a slight perturbation up at the top may make the person develop a different gender than they would otherwise. But again, that's just applying the principles of developmental biology. If we don't really know how gender develops, we don't know that those environmental estrogens do that. So short answer is maybe. Longer answer is I don't know. But I think the evidence of the increase in females to male transition would go against that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you, David. All right, back to Del. Let's see if we get your unmute button working. There it is.
Am I still good? Am I good?
You're good. You're good.
Hooray, the magic of technology. Anyway, thanks, Randy. And Tony, thanks for the article. I think you got my praise for it in the question. And you've kind of led into my question about adult versus adolescent. And pretty much I was struck by the ambiguity in the literature that you report, maybe even uncertainty about things. But I wonder whether we ought to be setting adolescents on a path toward transitioning. And among the reasons would be that, as you note, there's gender dysphorias based on self-reporting without any biological underpinning as of yet. And yet the transitioning process with hormones and probably surgery are simply biological, may not be reversible, and may very well lead to significant medical issues in the future. And with the other report that almost 50% of adolescents with reporting gender dysphoria desist, I kind of think that might be a red flag that if we're affirming adolescents in their transition, even to the point of referring them to counseling under an affirmative paradigm, if it turns out something to be unwanted, that might be simply abuse of the person. So I wonder whether there's a place in the church to simply take a strong stand that transitioning is for adults, not minors, and to avoid arguments about any individual being mature enough to make that decision. I'll define minor as the legal age and whatever the state of residence is. So your thoughts, and with your introduction, I think you've got even more insightful thoughts than I would have expected.
Yeah, I don't know how to address the church aspect. What's the role of the church in that? However, that, the dilemma that you raise is certainly the case. And in fact, from my understanding, that's exactly what's going on in the Arkansas trial right now, is that the state of Arkansas wants to ban the transitioning before the age of, I think it's 18 or so. And it's not that they're against it in total, but they say, let's let the child go through adolescence and see whether the child persists or desists. Now, in Europe, that is the case. And in many of the countries that I'm thinking of, like Finland, Sweden, the UK had this case where someone transitioned and then transitioned back and sued. And so they are reining things in quite a bit in Europe and saying, let's just wait until we're sure about this persistence, desistance thing. I play the organ in my church, by the way, and there's an organist, a trans organist that I follow. Her name is Chris Rizzotto, and Rizzotto, I'm thinking. And I watched a YouTube conversation that she had basically on her gender dysphoria and transitioning and stuff. And she actually waited until her 20s or so to transition from male to female. And part of it is that she's married to a woman and she wanted to have children. And she also says, this is not something I asked for, and I'm biologically male, so I wanted to be a parent. And I think this is how it should happen. But she also said the intensity of the dysphoria was incredible going through puberty. But she said this is the way I wanted to do that. So early transitioning means that the child will be infertile, and is the child able to recognize that thing? But on the other hand, we need to recognize the intensity of the dysphoria as they go through puberty. So it's a struggle, but I would fall down on the wait and see category, simply because you don't want someone to transition who would have desisted.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So those are the questions in advance, and we've got 4 hands up already. And if anyone else wants to comment, please raise your hand as well. So first of all, we have Joe Lechner and then Cy Gart. So Joe, good to hear from you.
Hi, Randy. Hi, Tony. I have both a chemical question and a religious one, so I'll ask the chemistry question first. Are any kinds of chemical measurements being made on individuals who present as dysphoric?
In terms of, let's say, hormone levels and things like that, I imagine they are. However, I think the real question is, what were the chemical levels when the brain's sex was developing in utero? And I saw a paper just this week. I was kind of looking into that, and they were looking at mothers who were exposed to environmental estrogens and seeing what those levels were. And then they looked at the children later on to see, did the children have more behaviors that were consistent with their sex or not? Now, that's not gender identity, that's gender behavior. And if anything, it was subtle and really not much to speak of. But I think the issue really is, what's the hormonal levels, if it's hormones, in utero as the brain is developing. So later on, it doesn't matter, because if the pattern's already set. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So religious question.
Thank you. How would you respond to a Christian minister who is very opposed to trans? He dismisses that they have any valid dysphoria, and he refutes their claim that, well, God made a mistake with me, and that's the way I am.
Yeah, that's a tough question, because then we get into arguments and debates, and I think that's not helpful. I think my own pastor has the same sort of position. You're not going to be able to convince someone until you actually have a relationship of trust with them. So if you say, I trust your judgment, I trust your expertise and whatever, and then they might listen to you. So I have a former pastor from Montreal that he and I have emailed back and forth, and he's much more open to listening to what I have to say. It's a tough one, but we can't get into this whole, arguing back and forth. We have to start reading and having longer conversations. And I think that's where the church is not helping, where people completely dismiss it. But I admit that was my position at first, until I really started looking into it as well. I'm not giving you a good answer, but I think we just have to be careful how we address that.
Okay. Thank you very much, Joe. Cy.
Hi, Tony. Let me say that I really enjoyed your article. I found it very informative, very well balanced. I learned a lot from it. I think it was, I can say with authority, I think it was the best article in that issue of the journal. So my question is related to this. One of the problems with this whole issue, I think, is, as you just were talking about, is political. It seems that this is a medical scientific issue that has been politicized from both ends. Since I know very little about this, there have been times I've asked questions about transgender situations, and I've been called transphobic simply for raising a question. So my question to you is, have you had any feedback, either from your talks or this article or any other anything else you've done in this field, that were negative from either direction, either from, the kind of thing we just heard about, or from people who are very sensitive to transphobia. Has anyone ever, have you had any feedback of that sort?
Well, I'm sure there are people who disagree with my position. What I haven't had yet is a detailed critique of what I wrote. And actually, I would look forward to that, saying, okay, what is it that you don't like? I've tried to be cautious and tentative in my conclusions as well. But I'm sure there will be people, like I said, I gave a talk at the beginning of October at John Brown University. And that's the one that I cited in the letter to the editor. And there was one person who just had a hard time being open to the idea that it may actually exist in some people. But the conversation was cordial. But I haven't had a detailed critique of my article. That's what I would like actually to see. So we can actually move on. And Randy and I were talking before the meeting, is one of the things about the ASA is that we can have difference of opinion within the ASA, and that's good. And I think we actually need to have that difference of opinion in order to advance further. If we're all talking the same thing, we're not going anywhere. So we need good disagreements. And so I welcome any kind of disagreement. So we can push this a little bit further, because there's a lot I don't know.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Cy. Next will be Dana, and after Dana will be Luca.
Hi, Dana.
Hi, Tony. So my question is actually related to a question that was asked earlier about the Christian worldview. Could you expand on, and maybe you could not answer this question for the gentleman, it was Ken Turian who asked it, given that the medical community looks at gender in a bimodal way, that we no longer think of gender as being dichotomous and unchangeable, given that fact within the respect of science, what is the Christian view of that then? And so the question that was asked is, how is the Christian worldview connected to gender? What is it about the Christian worldview that will negate that aspect of humanity?
Yeah, thanks for that. Okay, so at the beginning, you talked about gender being bimodal, and the argument there is that it's because of intersex people. You have people who are androgen insensitive, and they're actually biologically male, but they are physically female. There's a whole developmental pathways that are involved. I mean, you start with an SRY gene in males, and that gets turned on in development, and then the testes develop, and everything else develops. And there can be, I don't want to use the word defects, but things where that process doesn't happen, and the person may end up with indeterminate genitalia, or something doesn't happen. I would actually question the definition of gender as being bimodal. I would still say it is binary. And what we can have is exceptions to that. It's not a spectrum. I would say it's male or female, but sometimes things don't work, and therefore you get something that might be intersex. I don't see it as a spectrum in terms of the sex. So that's the one question. And then the other question is Christians. How do Christians look at it? And I elaborated a little bit in the article as well. It's a challenge because the Bible doesn't consider transgender or anything like that. The closest it comes is eunuchs, but eunuchs are really male who are castrated. But what we see in Scripture is a pattern of complementarity. And that complementarity happens all the way from Adam and Eve, all the way through the idea of complementarity between different individuals. And even in terms of the church is the bride of Christ. And so we see that pattern throughout Scripture of a complementarity. The other thing is one's sex is maintained even after death. So I think of on the Mount of Transfiguration, we had Elijah and Moses. They were still men. Samuel, when he was called up by the witch of Endor, was still a man. And so that's probably the strongest argument that I can see for a distinction between males and females, a Christian perspective on that. But again, I'd love to hear more And I'd love to get feedback on that. But I have communicated with various people, theologians, both at Dort and elsewhere, to get some feedback from them. And there is actually a book, Theology of the Body, on my shelf back there. I got a whole bunch of books on the shelf where I've been reading on that. And so that's what I would say is a Christian perspective on that. But I realize people disagree with that. Austin Harkey is one that.
If I may, just as a follow-up then, what do we do with these individuals who do not fall into that binary framework?
Right. Well, certainly not condemn them. That's the problem. And that's where the church is not very good. I think we love them and we help them in many ways. And I think, and this is where I would support Greg Eilers as well, because he had gender dysphoria and he said, I can't function as a man. And so I would say it's okay for him to transition, which he did for a time because he was non-functional. And so that's not to say that there is a spectrum or you can be whatever you want. It says we need to allow that person to be functional. And I think I mentioned in the article, if someone has a cancerous leg, well, it's okay to cut it off. And you don't cut it off because you want to lose a leg, but in some cases, in order to function, you need to allow that sort of transitioning to occur. Now, there are some people who disagree with me on that as well, but I think, yeah, to a certain extent, and Yarhouse and Sadusky likewise say the same thing, is you do as little as possible to relieve the dysphoria. And if you try something and like say social transitioning and it doesn't work, well, then you go further and then you go further. But I think transitioning itself, whatever level, I don't think is wrong per se, because it may be necessary simply for the person to be able to function.
All right. Thank you very much. Okay, we're going to Luca, and after that will be Paul Nay. Luca, unmute yourself. Good.
So this is actually Luca's wife, Christy.
Oh, hi. It's okay, Krista.
We don't know. The camera's not on.
You did right. You couldn't right. See you. All right.
Luca's here too.
That's great. Okay, much better.
All right. So we are in our 20s, so you can imagine we know a lot of people who this affects because this has seemed to be kind of an epidemic among the young people of today. And I did want to say I appreciate your talking about how every case is different, because I know in my personal experience, a lot of people that I've known who have suffered from gender dysphoria, some of them, it's almost certainly environmental factors that, you can point to. There's one I know of who you can point to, her mom was taking testosterone when she was pregnant. And not surprisingly, that really messed with the gender perception of her daughter. There are others, though, that I think very likely came out of traumatic personal experience, especially as a child, especially sexual abuse. And I wonder if that might have to do with the imbalance between how many people there are transitioning female to male rather than male to female. But the question I wanted to ask was actually not on either of those. That I thought your article was very good. I thought it encompassed most of the issues that I've thought of on this issue, and some that I hadn't. But the one thing that I didn't see addressed that I wanted to ask about is the idea that essentially if gender dysphoria is the brain telling you you're one sex and the body showing you that you're the other. Mm-hmm. If you're going to not be dysphoric, you have to fix one of those. You have to change either your brain or your body. But it's physically impossible to change your sex. You can pretend, you can make yourself look like it, but every cell in your body is going to have the genetics that you were born with. So how is transitioning not just living a lie, pretending that you are something else? It feels a lot like cutting off your arm because you don't think that your arm belongs to you, instead of trying to heal your brain. And I know it's really difficult because we're not very good at healing brains yet. Certainly, psychology is a very difficult field because every brain is so different. But as we learn more about brain plasticity and how we can heal brains, I think it's very sad that our culture has gone to transition is the solution instead of trying to figure out how do you heal the brain rather than just change the body to pretend. So I guess I'm looking for your response on that and how I don't see transition as anything except living a lie. pretending that you are a sex that you aren't, too.
Yeah, okay. Again, I keep referring to Greg Eilers, but he's been so helpful to me. And even when he was transitioning and when he was Gina, Gina would still say that Gina is a man, living as a woman because that's the only way to resolve the dysphoria. And so with the transitioning, it's when these people look in the mirror and see a body that's opposite of what their brain is saying they are, that causes the distress. And so what they're doing is doing physical changes to minimize that sort of distress. But they realize biologically they are male. Yes, that's absolutely the case. Now, I think for people with the gender dysphoria, especially the early onset, if we had a surefire way of, let's say, doing hormonal treatments that would resolve the dysphoria, I think all of them would love it. And in Greg's case, it happened to be taking estrogen, which really is kind of strange. But it works for him. And he knows of other cases where it's like that. But for most people who are taking hormones, that isn't the case. So we just don't know enough. And I would hope to trust the medical community enough so that if we ever find out a treatment regimen that would resolve the dysphoria, that they would promote that, because that would make the most sense to me. But I think we're a long ways from doing that because, a lot of the development just happens earlier on. And by the time you get to that set, and it's not like you can just, pray it away or try really hard or anything like that. It's sort of like, you can't treat depression or anxiety by saying, we just got to try harder. And I think it's the same thing here. So long answer, but it would be nice, but I don't think we're there.
Yeah, thank you. But may I interject a question here? Because as Luca was saying, something about the every cell in your body has a genetic structure, but you haven't said very much, Tony, about what should I say, disruption in the genetic sequence itself. And I think there have been some papers, a few that I'm not really into the literature, but the X and Y chromosomes may not always be so coherent, so that in that case, wouldn't all the cells in the body have an ambiguous kind of state?
I wouldn't think so, not genetically. If someone is going to transition from male to female, for example, what they'll need to take is testosterone blockers and estrogen. The cells in their body would still be the same cells. Gene expression would change. And in fact, your personality changes when you switch from estrogen to testosterone or the other way around. Your body features will change somewhat as well. But genetically, your cells are not going to change. But
right, but they may not be binary is my point. They're not going to change, but
no, they're not going to change. They're going to stay the sex that they were, and that's the thing.
That's correct.
Biology,
but they may be ambiguous in terms of their sex.
The cells, no,
the genomic sequence,
no, they would stay the sex that it was born with.
Which, okay, we'll pass. I don't quite follow you. We'll talk about that later. Thank you very much.
The sex wouldn't change with the transition. The gender would.
That's right. I wasn't talking about the changes, right? So, okay, thank you very much for that question. Paul, up to you. And then Yitzi.
I got to be careful because I may take too much time, but you ask for a little feedback medically and whatever on your article. And first of all, I want to congratulate you on that article. It was wonderful. And there were things in it I didn't know. And the reason I say that is because for decades I've been giving lectures in the church on gays and lesbians in the church and the biology of such, which has changed dramatically thanks to DSD. And I did this with my cousin, who's a Lutheran pastor and a clinical psychologist, and was vehemently, like my father, who was also a theologian, against gays in the church. And after many discussions, we sort of changed, including what he thinks the Bible says. But let me just tell you about DSD and why that has changed my lectures.
You mean disorders of sexual development?
Yeah, I'm going to get into that. But
DSD
let me just point out that my favorite quote is is a cartoon where a teacher asks a student, John, you understand it now? Johnny says, no, but I'm confused on a higher plane. And that's where I stand. But listen, DSD, every urology resident has to know about DSD. And they have tests on it. It used to be extremely complex. It still is. And basically it is, and we see that I'm a urologist. I was head of the department at the University of Washington and a cancer researcher, but I've been in this for quite some time, including the DSD clinic at Seattle Children's. And every urologist knows that that we have these children, three or four a month, who come in, and we can't tell if they're male or female. Mm-hmm. And we know that if testosterone isn't there or isn't working right, and there's a tremendous spectrum, the external genitalia automatically become female, even though they're XY.
Yep.
And we had these beautiful operations that we did on babies and young kids to convert them. In most cases, and I'll just take the male to female, we convert them to female. And in fact, sometimes we didn't even tell the kid. And we thought it was tabula rasa and everything would be fine until we started to look at what they're like when they were in their 20s and 30s, and a vast majority of them were extremely unhappy, et cetera. And then we suddenly realized that this testosterone and androgens and everything not only worked on the external genitalia, but worked on the brain. And the work in animals, including fruit flies, et cetera, validate this. And that, and so now this operation that we did all the time is malpractice. And what we do is we stall. Well, we try to figure out what exactly this child's brain is. And
keep on.
Keep going. I just wanted to grab a book off my shelf.
Oh, okay. And so it's very hard. And the DSD clinic, what used to be 2 or 3 people, has now become a gigantic clinic as all these children and parents come in, and they're not just DSD. And by the way, if you said disorders in sexual differentiation, you would get wrapped right now, because now it's called differences in sexual differentiation, because we now believe in neurodiversity. And basically, and I sent your article to the people at Children's, and they were quite complimentary, but also vehemently emotional about some of the things they disagreed with. But unfortunately, they still haven't sent me their comments, and I couldn't get them to be on this program. Anyhow, the bottom line, as far as they're concerned, is that the truly legitimate differences in gender identity and sexual preference all have to do with the heterogeneous influences of androgens and related compounds on the fetal brain. And the problem is that it is extremely complex. There's so much we don't know about it. And they are terribly emotional that politics and state legislators getting involved in what is an extremely difficult thing. But not only in patients who have intersex problems, perineal confusion, but even in people who have normal external genitalia and internal genitalia, they basically believe that it's the same thing, with all of the complexities of kids acting out, confused, and whatever. They do think late onset there is such a thing, and it's environmental, whatever. But it's not quite so simple. In other words, they didn't suddenly become trans. That often they were trans to begin with, but were in denial, confusion, whatever. Bruce Jenner, for example, he probably, or others like it, they probably knew from the very beginning, but they were in extreme denial about it. So my question, is responding to this. So they would differ and say, you said biological sex is not a spectrum. They would say that's not true. It is, because biology is quantitative, not qualitative, and there's probably a tremendous range of preferences, many of which will be never uncovered, much like our faces. And so neurodiversity becomes a word. And there's a lot we don't know, but they're very worried about these kids who are truly biologically different, and suicide and all these things. And sure, they've gone too far in the sense that early woke education in kindergarten is getting to be a problem. I might also just end up by saying that it's become a tremendous field in urology, just out of the technical parts. The female to male, and I've participated in these surgeries. I mean, the male to female is simple, and it's now, the complications are much less than they used to be. And, a non-medical person looking at this, at that, would not be able to tell the difference in many cases. The female to male is a tremendous challenge. It is technically probably one of the most difficult surgeries we do. And there are many residents now, including women, who are flocking into this field because the challenges of this surgery, female to male, are tremendous. So my question is, how are you reacting to this? Are these DSD people going too far in terms of making everything biological?
Oh, that's your question? How do we deal with it?
I'm not sure, personally. I'm confused.
I'd like to see, again, a coherent critique of what's going on. Just the nature of biological reproduction has to be binary. You have a male and you have an innie and an outie. So it's hard to say. I mean, there can be different variations of that. And I think we have to be careful not to look to the animal kingdom, because you've got animals switching sex and things like that. That's not the same as in humans. It doesn't happen in mammals. So we have to be careful there. But
what do you mean? Say it doesn't happen in mammals? What?
Switching sex. Unless you introduce a genetic mutation or you perturb the system. And so that's what the DSDs would be, that the system is perturbed. The normal pathway to one or the other is disrupted, and then you might go to the female default. But
5% of rams are gay.
5% of what? Of rams?
Yeah, normally.
Okay,
and
that's gay. That's not gender.
Seems to be true in mice also. And of course, they've got all these genes and proteins now that they're trying to figure out, just like they did in Drosophila. But anyway, I don't know what's going on, except that I sit there and listen to this now large group of people, psychologists, basic scientists, and clinicians who are dealing with this.
Bonobos engage in sexual activity, homosexual activity all the time. That may be specific to their animals. So I'm not sure you can extrapolate from other animals to humans or so. The book I was getting, by the way, is As Nature Made Him. So this, John, he was writing about, it was David Dimer, I think it was his name, it was a botched circumcision as a baby. So they said, let's raise him as a girl. And his life was a total mess. He ended up transitioning back to a boy, but committed suicide. And that was all under John Money's influence, that gender really is, it's a social construct, which I strongly disagree with. But anyway, so I don't have a good answer to your question. I just kind of look at the biology, and there's a whole lot of biology we don't know. But I would disagree. I'm still holding to the binary nature of sex, even though there are exceptions.
Yeah. For the record, could somebody put a link to that book on the chat? I think you said the name, but
As Nature Made Him, and the subtitle is The Boy Who Was Raised as a Girl.
All right. Yeah. Somebody can look that up for him. Okay. Thank you very much, Paul. Now I'm usurping your authority here, Jim, but Paul, how about writing your own article here? Just to add.
Well, I've written it up several times and presented it in non-church environments. And I'm doing it again now that, although the last 2 years with COVID, I have not kept up because I haven't had to give a talk. But no, I still think what I'm doing is just a great term paper.
Yeah,
and what you did was fantastic. Dr. Jelsma. There were some references in there. I thought I'd read everything, but there were a lot of things I hadn't.
Well,
there's lots more where they came from. Trust me.
Send your draft to Jim. He'll be happy to look at it. Okay, Yitzi, thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you
barely.
fine.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. First of all, Tony, my admiration for the ton of work you've done on that paper. It's very helpful. Just last week, I used it to have a discussion in our small group about these issues.
Oh, good.
And I think that's where it has to go. A lot of education has to happen before anything else changes. Anyway, my question is related to the Dutch protocol that you mentioned. And according to that protocol, they are delaying puberty in order to make it possible for people to make informed, mature decisions. My question is, this procedure of delaying maturity, doesn't that also delay maturation in terms of understanding and moral sensitivity, so that actually you wouldn't bring a person to a point where a more mature decision can be made?
Exactly. I think that's exactly what's happening, because if you're delaying the maturation of the brain, then you're delaying. Yeah, you're delaying the very thing that would cause the resolution if it would happen. And in studies that they've done is when they put the people on these puberty blockers, almost every one of them continues to transition once, after a few years. So they figure, well, they're older now, they've had the more maturity, but their brain hasn't developed, and so you're blocking the very thing that would cause the dissolution. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Tony.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much, Yitzi. Charles, you're next.
I'm astonished it actually got to me. I was way down the list.
Yeah, we'll get to you, right?
Thank you very much, Tony. I really appreciate all the work you're doing. This is very important. I appreciate it. I have to start by just saying this is completely outside of my area. I'm an engineer. I teach engineering. And the reason it got in my face was because my wife and I were on a long drive, and we just had found an article written by a psychiatrist who was talking about a legal case in Nevada about gender dysphoria.
Sorry, I didn't hear exactly what you said. Could you repeat that last sentence?
Yeah, we were on a long drive, and so we read to each other an article that we had found that was about gender dysphoria, written by a psychiatrist who was involved in a legal case in Nevada. And he was discussing the whole situation. And I thought, I've never known anything about this, and it's not in the Bible. So I thought, it's not really something I figure it's one of those things that's sort of on the fringes that I'm not going to be involved in. So I never thought about it. But the thing that caught my attention in that article, we were on a 10-hour drive, and that was that the psychiatrist said people that are suffering from this dysphoria, about 40% of them commit suicide. And when I heard that, I just fell out of my chair. I was like, that's something that the church really needs to be sensitive to. Yeah. We need to have compassion in this case. This is not a theological issue. This is what I was shocked. So I think that's the starting point, because it's not one of these black and white. It's not like, adultery. It's not like murder. It's not one of these things where you can say, well, it's clearly delineated in the scripture. This is something that is something that needs to be handled with a lot of compassion. So, but I do have a question for you, and this is because my curiosity about this grew out of reading that article with my wife. I'm at the University of California, and we have the so-called LGBTQIA plus resource center, which is a major facility on campus, 40,000 students, and everybody's introduced to it in orientation. And it's a beehive. And it's basically a topic where I'm not permitted to say anything. As a matter of fact, I would probably gain enormous acrimony if people knew that I was sitting here listening to you. That's how politicized this whole thing is. And the thing that bothered me about it is I thought, wait a second. If we're talking about gender dysphoria or the transgender issues that people are genuinely struggling with, how does that relate to homosexuality, or how does that relate to what people are calling queer, or asexual behavior, or anything like that? So it's a completely different topic. And I asked that question with groups. In fact, I asked at the ASA, I asked some people, said, well, why are they lumping this together? They said, because it's a group of political activists that want to work together and sort of group with each other so that they can get some political legroom to work with. And I thought, well, there's a problem there. And right now, it's really a problem because, for example, it's there are lawyers right now that their whole specialty is transgender legalism. And basically, if they walk in the courtroom, the judge just bows and says, whatever you want, you get. And in California, it's frightening because my prayer partner, his son, wanted to, win a legal battle with the mother of his daughter. And so what he did is he announced that he's not a man, he's a woman. He's never shown any signs of this. He's in the late 30s, and he just said, I'm transgender. He started walking around in a dress, and he hired one of these lawyers. And now all of a sudden, everybody's like, we can't touch this guy. We can't. He's committed felonies, and they're talking about dismissing them because he's one of this group that we can't touch because of the California legal system right now, and just the absolute waterfall of laws that are being passed that are protecting. They're not necessarily, I think, genuinely protecting, but they say they're protecting transgender experienced people. And I feel like, is that really what's happening, or is this becoming a political football where people get elected for it, people can get their way legally? How do we deal with that as the church? Because I want to make sure that we have compassion, and at the same time, I don't want people to drive their train over us. Does that make sense? Is this a good question?
It does. I just feel I'm ill-equipped to address the latter issue because I'm a biologist and I'm a scientist. Of course, I'm a citizen, or I will be on Tuesday. But I don't like working in the political arena. That's why it's taken me 23 years to get my American citizenship. But I did want to address the earlier question or earlier comment you made about the high incidence of suicide and people. And it's true, it is really high. We also need to know, though, that there's an incredibly high incidence of comorbidities in people with gender dysphoria in adolescence. Things like depression, anxiety, conflict, bullying, and all those sorts of things. And I keep referencing Mark Yarhouse, and that's another book. And he said, in the counseling context, you need to deal with those comorbidities first. And so they may be contributing to a lot of the problem, that hopefully you can clear those out of the way, and then we can address the gender. So it's true that there's a very high incidence of suicide in these people. It's also high afterwards, but maybe for different reasons, because if they've transitioned, they don't really pass, and then they have expensive medical bills and all that sort of stuff. But still, and I kind of touched on that in my article as well, but there are a lot of other issues going on besides the gender dysphoria. But as for the political stuff, I really don't see the T as belonging with the other ones, because transgender is really your personal, the way you identify, the way you see yourself. The L, G, and B are really how you look outward and your attraction to others. So I agree. And there is a potential split within that community as well. So that point may be well taken, but I just really don't want to go there because I want to be apolitical.
I like to be apolitical as well.
But we do live in a political world, don't we? Yeah. It's tough. Okay, thank you very much, Charles. David Saunders. Yeah, unmute yourself, please, and then we can hear you. Let's see. Okay. It's that icon in the lower left. If you can get that on your screen. The icon in the lower left. Mute. Can you see it there? No? Well, let's
Zoom
see.
should make it easier to do that.
They should, but for reasons they don't allow us to unmute anyone. All we can do is ask someone to. All right, got it. Good. Go ahead.
Okay. First of all, I'd say I very much appreciate the comments that transitioning should be delayed until, one has reached a level of maturity that one can make a valid an informed decision about this and not just jump into it as the latest thing as a, very suggestible adolescent. Anyway, I know that most of this discussion has addressed the biological level about brain development or about, biochemical factors that we might be getting from the environment or whatever. But I have a question about the psychology of related to this explosion of desire to transition, especially among adolescent girls. And I'm wondering how much of that is really biological and how much of it is psychological. The brain is not really developed until sometimes early in the 20s, and I think that adolescents are very suggestive. They can be influenced by friends, by groups, and I think that also, particularly for the women who want to transition, there's also the parallel movement in our culture that looks upon men as they're the guys who control everything. They have it better than we do. So yeah, why not transition to a man, and that will solve my problems. And I'm just wondering, how much of this desire to transition from female to male comes from a psychological kind of train that people are jumping on because their friends are on it, and you can pick it up on you can also pick it up on the web and find new friends if you don't have any friends in your own school to affirm you in this. So, yeah, Tony, I know you haven't. I know you addressed it a little bit in the article, but how much of this desire to transition do you think is psychological?
Well, yeah, I'm stepping into a minefield here, but I'm hesitant to say a desire to transition. What I'm thinking more, and that's what I talked about this summer at the ASA meeting, is that if the mind-body, or sort of the brain-body connection, whatever is not, which develops tremendously in adolescence, if that doesn't develop because of things like other comorbidities and stuff, then people might be more open to suggestion that they are actually the wrong gender. Now, I'm not saying that's the case in every case, but yes, there have been, the whole idea of the social contagion and Lisa Littman, and people are not happy with her, but there's a variety of people who've made those kind of arguments that exists. So people may be more suggestible. But again, we have to be careful not to generalize and let's look at each case individually and see what's going on. But I would argue that our connection between the brain and the body develops tremendously in adolescence. And if that is impeded, then that stability is not there. And again, I don't know if you were at the talk this summer, if you can still find it on the web. Things follows up of the sort of body illusion things that you can do suggest that maybe our gender, our sense of gender, is not as fixed as we might think it would be. Now that's for the late onset stuff. The early onset, I think, is different, but that would take too long to explain all that. But if you have a chance to watch my talk for this summer, there's some of that, or even the link that I put in the letter to the editor, response to the letter to the editor, and I explain it better there. So it's not a good answer, but there's something to what you say, but I think we have to be careful how we approach it.
Yep. Okay. Very good. Jay, it's good to see you back on the program again. Let's hear from you. Take yourself off mute.
Thank you very much for everyone and for all your comments. I have to say that for a reason that Ken maybe alluded to, I have a personal interest in researching this deeply and have spent a fair amount of time on it. I really liked what you said about many of these changes in the brain and these things that many of the transgender activists sort of cite as definitive proof, just as we know the plasticity of the brain can change both ways. But actually, I would like to ask Paul Lang, who has his hand up too, a little bit about how he has felt about doing the surgeries on these people. My medical school, Oregon, wrote an article, I think it was in the urology literature about a year ago, and they were telling about how this is a great financial boon. We really you ought to do these transitional surgeries and et cetera, et cetera. But I wonder if he said he's participating in some. How does he feel about it when he sees a patient back? Does he feel like he's really done a good job? And then I have one more comment that I'll get back to our presenter real quickly about was, one of the things that as I teach medical students and residents, I say you got to use scientific theory to try to understand things. And one of the things that bothers me about the transgender advocates is that they will say, gee, the reason the suicide doesn't go down after they've transitioned is because they're not accepted. Well, you know what? I'm going to try the theory out. I'm going to tell society that if we just accept smokers and just everyone embrace them and everything else and let them smoke wherever they want to, then the cancer risk associated with smokers go away. Oh, no, never mind. I'm going to shut up and listen for a response.
Paul, you want to address Jay's question first?
Again, I'm confused on higher planes. First of all, with regard to the politics of it, you're right. And now the extreme, well, I don't know what's right or left, I guess. They're trying to say that circumcision is malpractice, so they're carrying it way too far. It's like early woke education among the kindergartners. Great idea, wrong species. And the Germans learned that when they tried to introduce the horrible Holocaust pictures to kindergartners and learned the hard way that was, too much. And it's gone way too far. And this is one of the things and I sent Randy 2 articles from the New England Journal that just came out, appalling how this has become so political, and it's such a terrible problem. And it's true. These people, well, not so much gays anymore, but transgender, they are they commit suicide and whatever. But if you're trying to solve one problem and make another one, which is all these tremendous number of confused kids that are more confused than they were before because of all the publicity. So it's gone way too far. And we're in a place of ignorance. I would say that if you talk to the DSD people, and I guess myself, I think that both gender identity and sexual preference are a heterogeneous spectrum of the same thing. I don't think they're different. And we don't understand very much about it, except that I believe that the heterogeneity is tremendous, although society can only take so many pronouns. And I don't know exactly how to solve this other than to trust science and to love and accept. And I just came across this term because it was in the last Scientific American, looking at how they should and shouldn't change autistic kids. And they said, well, wait a minute now, we can't change everything, and not eye contact or whatever. We don't change that because we have to understand that that's neurodiversity, the spectrum of the human condition, that we love our neighbor. And so I think that's the bottom line as we deal with this as Christians. And I don't know where it ends.
Yeah. Okay.
Other than the fact,
Paul,
yeah.
Paul, those editorials you sent me, is there any chance you can put links to those on the chat? That then everyone can take a look. I wasn't able to distribute them.
They don't. Yeah, the New England Journal. I used to be on the board. It does publish things.
They are. So if you've got those links, because you didn't include the links with me, I have a hard time doing it. Okay, back to I guess Krista. I think you said your name was Christy.
This time it's Luca, actually.
Oh, this time it's Luca. Boy, you guys know how to fake us out, right? So maybe that's Trent. No, I'm sure you shouldn't say that.
There are actually two of us.
Okay, go ahead.
So I want to say thanks to everybody for having this conversation, and thank you for writing the article. I found it really insightful, and I appreciated the balanced approach. I'd like to circle back the conversation on the church's response to people experiencing gender dysphoria. And I guess I'm talking not so much as the church as an institution, but the church as the members of Christ, the individuals representing him here on earth. And I do think that my personal stance is that we need to have compassion and focus on healing the people who are suffering, whether it's gender dysphoria or any other affliction that they might be experiencing, psychological or physical. But I also think that not all solutions are equal, and that the end doesn't always justify the means. That healing somebody, there could be a dozen ways to do that, and some of those ways could be really good, and some of those ways can cause harm or fight against the will of God in His plan. So I won't go into any specific details on that, because I think that we as Christians need to have the guidance of the Holy Spirit, and we need to take things on a case-by-case basis, look at those comorbidities, and start to heal people from whatever direction we feel that God is guiding us toward. And guiding them forward.
Thanks for that. I appreciate that sort of focus, because I'm worried that we're just kind of treating these people casually. And even when I say these people as a group, but we need to be in a relationship with them, and on an individual relationship, one built of love and trust, and then try to sort out what's going on. But yeah, your point is well taken. But sometimes we may have the guidance of the Holy Spirit, but still make wrong decisions. And hopefully that'll sort itself out.
And I also think, to make one other comment, that my personal belief is that people who are outside of the church, we need to lead to the gospel first. We need to point them to
Absolutely.
people who are in the church. I think it's not for me to say whether any person in theory is sinning at a given moment. But when they commit a sin, I think that the church in the modern day is not very into discipline, but that's what we're taught by Paul in various of his letters. And I think you can't call somebody to repent of their cancer, or I guess you can, it would be a bad idea. So we need to figure out what is the line between an affliction that needs to be healed through medicine and then affliction that is spiritual or psychological. Focus on guiding Christians toward behaving according to the will of God.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was emailing with a theologian in Indonesia, and he made the comment that people who think that you can just feel or try your way out of something like gender dysphoria, or just try really hard and help, that's really an over-realized eschatology. In other words, we think we can get to heaven now, but it's a long process, and we won't get there soon. So we just have to be careful about what we think we can do in this life, and it may not happen in this life.
Okay, our time is almost up. We always stop at 3:30 here. Hope we have time for one more question. Ken, go ahead, unmute yourself, and let's hear from you. There you go.
Okay, hi. I have to admit I didn't finish the article that was written, but I enjoyed what I had read. But I guess I'm just wondering, we're a whole generation of women taking birth control pills, which, are you have to admit that probably a certain amount of it gets peed down the drain and into our wastewater. Is it ending up in our groundwater and our drinking water and our food supply? Is that estrogen possibly just getting all through our eating and drinking and causing this increase in what seems to be an increase in this problem?
That question was raised earlier today about not just birth control pills, but environmental estrogens. And the best I can say is maybe, but we really don't know. I don't think it's accounting for the surge in cases of the late onset gender dysphoria. But to what extent other ones it might be, there's a whole lot of speculation in this field. So maybe.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. So, we have 30 seconds left, which is just enough time for me to thank you, Tony, for your years of hard work. Thank you for opening yourself up as your personal perspective, your personal involvement here, for sharing with us, and your honesty in saying how much remains to be known and studied. And I hope this program will stimulate at least some of you knowledge to join the team and dig into it and share your results, publish it, and share it with the rest of us. So with that, thank you very much, Tony, and farewell to you.